Elon Musk's DOGE claims to be rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse. But is that just a fig leaf for the most radical conservative attack on the state that America has ever seen? What will be the consequences of such drastic cuts and layoffs to the departments that keep America running? And can the damage be repaired? Dr. Casey Burgat is director of the Legislative Affairs Program at George Washington University's Graduate School of Political Management. He's also the author of We Hold These Truths, How to Spot the Myths That Are Holding America Back, and hosts his own podcast, Mastering the Room. Hi, Casey. Thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Glad to be here.
So let's start with that claim that they are there only to root out waste, fraud, and abuse. Do DOGE's actions support that professed agenda?
Man, no, they don't, right? Like the intent is good, the mission is clear, which is why we see polling so supportive of this throughout the U.S. But one person's waste is another person's vital program, and so it's really hard to paint all of these cancellations or firings with the same brush of rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse. A lot of folks are going to argue that, no, this is just a lot of conservative Republicans led by an unelected bureaucrat, Elon Musk, just canceling things they don't like, which is a fundamental disruption of how the process is supposed to work and gives, obviously, the president a lot of powers that his predecessors didn't have and the Constitution didn't give him.
I mean, USAID is the perfect example there because it's not hyperbole to say that if you take away things like HIV medication, the PEPFAR program that George W. Bush introduced, that puts millions of people's lives at risk. And Felix Salmon said on your own podcast that actually, if you look at the numbers, this is kind of a rounding error, that most government money goes on a few very, very big things rather than these small ones. So, I mean, as a savings exercise, is it even worth, I mean, obviously there's a particular agenda there, but is it even worth touching agencies of that size?
Yeah, I mean, it's worth it. And this is honestly a fundamental responsibility of Congress, that the power of the purse comes with an associated responsibility that you know where that money is going. And for too long, Congress is led by both parties, not only have increased spending pretty dramatically, but they also don't do the required part of that job, which is the oversight of the actual money. And so this has led or created an instance where this sort of audit that Congress is supposed to do on itself, its own spending powers, it needed to be done by someone. And when you don't specify who that can be or carry it out yourself, you're going to leave yourself vulnerable to it being carried out by a president with whom you fundamentally disagree with. Or as we see now, the president's buddy, the billionaire buddy, to go in and access a lot of these payments. So to me, you can argue about what they're cutting. You can argue about, will it be impactful in terms of the size of the overall budget? So far, we don't have a clear yes on either of those things. But the purpose here is something that Congress should have been doing all along, and it's neglected it, leaving itself open to it being taken over by the executive branch.
So where does the government spend the most money?
Almost over 2/3 of it, coming up on 3/4 of it, 75% are what's called mandatory spending, things that are written in law that these have to be going out directly to payments to individuals. And so what we see in these constant shutdown battles, the funding battles that Congress and the president are constantly engaged in, that's only for about 1/4 of the federal budget. That is the discretionary side. What they debate and argue over, sometimes shutting down the government over, is on about 1/4 of the federal budget. Everything else is in this big group called mandatory spending, which is fancy words for entitlements. Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, something that a formula decides how much a certain eligible participant gets directly from the government.
And defense and national security, which is a huge part of the budget, what does that fall under?
Now we're getting nerdy here. We have defense discretionary and defense non-discretionary.
Okay, all right.
In that there are portions of each, but defense generally falls into that discretionary side of the category, which is why we never see politicians taking votes to lower the amount we're spending on defense or funding the troops. That's about as bad as a political vote you can take in Congress.
Now, DOGE has claimed to make savings, has published the numbers. I mean, it's a tiny percentage of the whole. How seriously should we take those numbers?
I don't know. How much do you trust Elon? Right? Like it's really hard, and this is where it's also really hard. Yeah, this is he can put whatever number he wants to put out. And when to claim savings means that you're canceling a contract now, or is this a payment that's already gone out, or how much of that original contract that he said he's canceled has already been sent out in payments, because these things are carried out over a period of years oftentimes. So I don't know. I don't take a ton of his numbers more trustworthy than a grain of salt. I don't think anyone should either. The point of the exercise is not the actual dollar savings, because as you said, this is a rounding error. This is less than what the Department of Defense spends on Post-its and paper clips probably. But the point is the message, and that they get to pick and choose and cherry pick just what the government is spending its monies on as a means of going after greater cuts to a lot of these big programs, which has always been their strategy.
And so, and as a side note, I really hate calling it DOGE because I think it's so incredibly unfunny. So I nearly want to call it DOGE. But so who actually runs it? Because the administration claims it's not Musk himself, but then you do have Trump and Musk frequently saying that it is.
Yeah, I don't have an answer. I mean, I don't know. And
well,
this is why I talked.
Yeah.
I talked to smart people, or especially on the reporting side of this, of like, we don't even know how big it is or where they're going day to day, and have they passed conflict of interest disclosures? Who are the people that are accessing a lot of these data? What powers do they have, and where do those grants of power come from? Like, these are fundamental questions, which is why these agencies have always been created by Congress and not the president, so that you can set these things up correctly, that there is direct oversight, and they can call them in for questioning and subpoena information requests. These are just fundamental powers of the Congress that have been forfeited to a president. And right now we don't have enough members of Congress to stand up to that president and say, hey, even if we agree that this department should exist, you don't have the power to create it. Which again leaves and all of us unbelievably vulnerable to how that power is carried out.
So yeah, Congress has the power of the public purse. It's meant to appropriate the funds, decide how they're spent. So I mean, this is probably a very naive question, but what is the legality of what DOGE is doing? Is there like a hard, will the courts be able to go, this is or is not legal, or does some of it depend on whether Congress actually wants to stand up for itself?
Yeah, it's always easier when Congress stands up to itself. The courts always defer to what's called legislative intent, especially with something in a constitutional power like the power of the purse is. It's written right there in the first branch of government. All legislative powers are with the Congress, and the power of the purse is one of those. But so if they stand up, they can slap a president around pretty good. And we've seen this throughout our history, though it's increasingly rare. But at the same time, is this illegal? You're going to need a court ruling here. And there's a couple problems to that. Number one, the courts don't work on a legislative calendar. They work on their own. And it's incredibly slow. And there's a lot of levels of appeal. And ultimately, you're going to have to get a Supreme Court ruling here, which could be months or years away. We saw that in Trump's first term with a lot of those subpoenas that were challenged and went through the courts on an incredibly slow timeline, even after he left office. The second thing here, and what we've seen so far be successful, is that we've seen the courts put a freeze on a lot of the DOGE freezes, right? I know I'm supposed to say DOGE, but a lot of freeze on the DOGE freezes.
Yeah.
But the problem there is that those are program by program or cut by cut, where you have to sue them individually. There hasn't been a successful lawsuit yet about the authority or the constitutional powers of DOGE writ large. I'm sure that's coming, but right now we don't have that playing out.
And a lot of people are worried about this PEPFAR thing because it does. I think it says about 1 million lives a year. Now, that seems to be something that, it's maybe the best thing George W. Bush did. So what's the status of that? I mean, presumably if you're talking about the courts, it'll take a while, then that means that people die. That seems to be the most kind of morally horrific, more than layoffs at the National Park Service. So just to take that as an example, what's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, the aid isn't getting to where it's most needed. And that's not only for the HIV-related programs, but a lot of food security and international security. Like, these are things this is why it's really important to get listeners to understand. This money has been appropriated, like it has been obligated. And a lot of times it's been spent in that it buys the supplies to carry out the programs that have been cut, at least at the surface level. So with the food security programs, there's been a lot of unbelievable reporting where that food has been bought, usually almost always from American farmers, that is then sent over to the places of needs. And now it's just literally rotting because there's not the money or the power anymore to be distributed to the populations it was supposed to go to. So this is going to have downstream effects beginning literally right now with starvation across the globe. And then things like pandemics or HIV or national security, where there's not a good tangible ROI on these things. We don't see it, we don't hear it, we don't feel it. What we're doing is spending money to prevent a lot of these things that can come back and have catastrophic consequences on ourselves later on, including national security with potential terrorist attacks. So these are things that they went after foreign aid on purpose, right? There's no constituency here. There's no domestic voter that is like, yes, I am a single issue voter, give money everywhere else but here. That person doesn't exist, which is why they went after it first. But that doesn't mean there won't be consequences here. And there are reasons why these programs exist in the first place. Should they be defensible? Absolutely. Every single program should. But it doesn't mean that you just take an absolute scalpel to all of it and we won't face any downstream consequences.
And so as I understand it, all the people kind of working at the DOGE are counted as special employees who don't actually require congressional confirmation. So that means they've got limited time. So do you think that deadline is making them more reckless?
I mean, anytime you have a deadline saying your power is going to be up, you're going to do a lot of things faster than you normally would. And with fast comes a lot of unintended consequences and outright errors. We've seen that, even how the data is prevented, in that he's just absolutely, Elon this is, because he's the public facing figure, is just spouting off numbers that with a little back checking end up to be false. That's probably a function of speed. And then it's also a function of them not being knowledgeable about how the government works. Right? Like this is an incredibly complicated business. So yes, the deadline is probably forcing people to speed up, and with speed often comes errors, especially at the magnitude we're dealing with here with trillion-dollar budgets and billions of people. But that SGE, that special government designation, I'm really interested in how enforceable that mechanism is going to be, in that you can only work about half the year under that designation before you have to qualify for a full-time employee. That's only if people are willing to stand up and make them qualify, right? Like, so like, do we have a Congress right now who's just cheering them on from the sidelines? Are they going to actually go to the mattresses and say, you know what, your designation is wrong, guy, and no longer do you have powers, or now we're going to start questioning you? I don't see it happening. And so to me, that is kind of a fictitious deadline that people are hoping for that actually won't come with the requisite powers.
Oh, yay.
Yeah. Good news. Good news. You're welcome.
And how is all this going down with the American public? Because the polling, it doesn't look particularly good. And while, you point out that I'm sure people across the US want to make sure that the money is being spent wisely, obviously everything you've just said sounds pretty terrible. So how is this going, and how do you think it will go down with the public?
Yeah, we've entered in a transition phase where early polling was, keep going, Elon. Especially again with foreign aid not being it was not an accidental first target. Everyone's like, cut it to the bone. We got problems here. Spend money here. That has started to shift when these personalized stories, when you start affecting everyday people's lives, not just the ones overseas that we'll never see or hear or recognize their problems and why that money is so important, but here right at home, because everyone, even if they hate the government, knows someone or depends on the government in some way. Everyone. And now we're starting to see a really personalized nature of a lot of these cuts, not only in people losing their jobs, but programs that they didn't even associate with the government, whether it's school food, parks and rec services, these things that people see and feel. Now it's like, shoot, I didn't know y'all were coming for me. This sounds horrible. And so we've started to see this, especially when we get into programs where you start affecting very, very engaged voters. And I'm talking senior citizens and with Medicaid and Medicare, right? Or these people are like, man, cut everything else, but do not touch my health care. How dare you? I earned this. And now we're starting to see very explicit statements from Elon, even though he's trying to walk them back sometimes when he remembers to, that we're not touching Medicare. And so there's just a lot of confusion. When you create confusion, you create people being scared. When you get people being scared, they're going to stop supporting things that they were willing to support when it didn't affect them.
And what is this all doing to the economy? I mean, it looks like the markets are freaking out. Unemployment's rising, obviously due to the massive layoffs. I mean, what's happening at the minute, and what do you think is coming around the corner?
Yeah, chaos, right? Like again, if Wall Street loves anything, they love stability and predictability. What they really struggle with, and what people do with their 401ks as a result, really struggle with confusion. And that's what we get not only with the DOGE of who's going to be affected next, but there's just a lot of missed messages even within this singular administration, where Trump's saying one thing, Senate Republicans are saying another. Musk goes on his own Twitter platform, X, whatever the hell we call it now, and says another. And so we don't even know or be able to make predictability. We see that unpredictability carried out within the chaos of the stock market. But this is also related to his economic policies, right? The tariffs, slapping them around. Sometimes they're on, sometimes they're off. Now they're doubled. Just the uncertainty that DOGE and everything else brings just creates an environment where stocks hate it. And then people start logging into their 401ks. And again, the uncertainty really freaks them out.
And obviously Musk's own business is suffering. I mean, he's personally lost...
I noticed that.
Yeah, he's personally lost at least 148 billion since inauguration day, and there's obviously always a chance that that could go up by the time this podcast is published. What is it that he's getting out of DOGE?
I don't know, right? Like if I were to give him some Harry Potter truth serum or something, this is one of the first questions I would ask him, because there's a real nefarious answer, and then there's just kind of a guy that is used to being in charge, now sees governments as his next horizon, and he wants to do that. He wants to CEO the government, and since he can't be president, then this is as close as he's going to get. But then you get into the nefarious answers of like, so this is a good John Grisham plot of like, this guy has a huge conflicts of interest, whether on the X side or the Tesla side or the Space Force side. And with that government data, I mean, these people pay billions and billions of dollars for access to information about their competitors. What better information about your competitors than their actual tax forms and their payment systems, to say nothing of what contracts do they have that I can get? Like that's a part where I don't want to go down that road, but I don't want to stop others from going down that road either, which is why that conflict of interest, that special government employee designation, is so key.
Yeah, well, I'm personally quite allergic to conspiracy theories, but it's like it's really hard to just slap that one down, isn't it, out of hand?
You know, that's what a lot of people who say I don't like conspiracy theories, except for the ones that make sense, right? Like everyone is.
This is a good one. So Michael Lewis has a new book out about federal employees who is government, and he'd written one before, The Fifth Risk. And obviously there are going to be employees who are, incompetent or wasteful, somewhere in that, I think 2.4 million, is it? I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a lot of people. But his argument is that most people actually don't know how government works, and they have this caricature of civil servants as just kind of bureaucrats, like just sort of pissing around or subverting the will of the people. And polling often shows that more than half Americans do think government is wasteful and inefficient. So is DOGE almost the inevitable conclusion of that degree of ignorance and suspicion, and one party that is intent on putting across that idea, and maybe the other party is not really pushing back on it?
Yes. Next question. Yeah, I mean, yes, that is literally, this is the end result. And couple the fact that Congress is incredibly unpopular, and it has done a bad job at keeping its own books on the power that it has with the power of the purse, right? Like, this is the inevitable byproduct of a lot of those things. But kudos to Michael Lewis. Like, everyone, I say government, and this includes my parents too, of like, I say government, and a picture immediately comes into your head of like this slow moving bureaucratic, your postal service employee, right? That doesn't care. They're just punching the clock, getting their pension, retiring. That is not my experience with not only Congress, congressional staffers, but the vast, vast, vast majority of these folks at agencies who are just literal experts on something very specific, very specific. And that can be anything from immigration visas to cybersecurity tax from the Middle East, right? And like, without these folks, you cannot cut these folks to the bone and not think that you're going to get a less successful version of government. If you think government is bad now, wait until you start filling it with amateurs or people who want to have partisan ends. That's where it gets super dangerous. And I think that's why Handmaid's Tale exists.
Well, one of the examples that comes up as an example of waste is people say, "Oh, $20 million on a puppet show in Iraq," which obviously sounds like a terrible investment. And I looked into this, and it's got like a version of Sesame Street. And Democrat Chris Coons says it's a show that helps teach values, public health, helps prevent kids from dying from dysentery and disease, helps push values like collaboration, peacefulness, and cooperation in a society where the alternative is ISIS, extremism, and terrorism. So then you go, oh. So this actually seems like, considering that America has some history in Iraq, you go, oh, okay, so like it's a soft power thing and it's got all this other stuff. But the top line story just sounds like, what are these mad people spending money on? So is there a problem that some of these programs, and you may disagree on still on the worth of this particular one, but is the problem that a lot of soft power is not obvious? The ROI, as you put it, it's not obvious.
Yeah, it's unmeasurable. Right? Because this Iraq one is a perfect example, because we spent untold billions, maybe even trillions of dollars on a literal boots on the ground war in Iraq. Right? So how much would investment and what types of investment would have prevented that from happening, from Iraq failing with their democratic experiment again, preventing folks from indoctrinating youth that lead to jihads, right? Like, how do you measure that? And then even worse, or even harder at least, is how do you prove that that program is doing that job?
Sure.
And so this is where it's incredibly difficult to convince people, because there's a saying in politics, if you're explaining, you're losing. And so just as you read that Democratic senator's response to what that program's message is, yeah, if you spend 30 seconds listening to that person, you explain it and you start nodding your way through, and then maybe you can get to a calculation. Well, 20 mil is definitely better than the $1 trillion that we spent on the war there. But think of how much you're asking of the American people. It is much simpler to just say, look at this garbage they spent on, right? Like, that is easier. And does it make it correct? No. But nuance is so often lost, and that can be weaponized by not only political parties, but obviously presidents and their henchmen.
So like you say, it only really starts to bite when it's hitting people's family members and they go, I didn't expect the leopards to eat my face.
Exactly.
As the saying goes.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for explaining all that, Casey. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Way to pick me up here on a Wednesday afternoon. This is awesome.